Hi, Misha here, and I've already checked out some of the early monoplanes and late biplanes used by the world's powers. For example, in America, the Boeing P-26 Peashooter. In Britain, the Gloucester Gladiator, and early versions of the Hurricane and Spitfire. And of course, in Germany, the Bf-109, the Japanese A6M0, and I will actually cover the A5M Claude. I've had that to do for a while, and I've had this one to do for a while too. The Russian Polikarpov I-16, nicknamed the Donkey in Russia, or the Moscow Fly in Spain. This was pretty much the premier fighter of the USSR before and early on in World War II. And like a lot of planes from the 30s, it was very advanced when first developed and introduced, and very obsolete by the early stages of the war. And for this history video, I have two models here. On the left, I have an Oxford. On the right, I actually have a postage stamp. I don't have a lot of postage stamps, but I kind of use them when nothing else is available. I think the Oxford definitely is a little neater, a little better detail. It did not come with the pilot. I stuck him in there. We'll call him Sasha for this video. The postage stamp, though, does have rotating propeller, which is always kind of neat. And these are inexpensive little models, and they're a lot of times the postage stamps do the kind of fit-to-box scaling, but it just so happens that for the I-16 that was 1 in 75, which is just, I mean, this is right on with the 1 in 72 Oxford, to the point you'd have to measure them or lay them top on bottom not to tell that they were identical. So yeah, talking about the history. And it all begins with Stalin, because it always does in Russia in that time period. Nikolai Polikarpov had designed various aircraft for Russia, like the R-1 and R-2, but his early attempts at fighters had not gone well. And in a very sane, mature fashion, Stalin understood this and gave him love and support. Nah, I'm just kidding. Stalin ordered him shot. But this was suspended. Talk about motivation. And he was kind of given a chance, and he started working on the I-15 biplane. And then in 1933, while finishing up the I-15, he started working on a very modern, advanced, low-wing monoplane design. It would have an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear. Very advanced features for 1933. The design was, started in June. It was kind of finalized by November of 1933, and the prototype flew for the first time on December 30th of that year. And then beginning in February of 1934, it entered into trials and testing by the VVS. And then in late March of 1934, it was accepted for Soviet military service. Unfortunately, the first versions that were put into pre-production were not able to be built with the engine they wanted, so they suffered from speed and maneuverability problems. But by 1935, the first major version to be produced in any numbers, the Type 5, started to appear. Now, what do we have here? This is a very small aircraft. In fact, during its day, it was the lightest aircraft or lightest fighter, I should say, in mass production. Only about 20 feet long, with a wingspan of 29.5 feet. Initially, the Type 5 had two 7.62 54R machine guns with roughly 450 rounds each. It did have an enclosed canopy, but very soon pilots would remove the rear glass or kind of wet bungee it open. This is because it had problems. For one thing, it liked to slam open and close during flight. For another, the glass was of less than great quality, so it wasn't as clear as they would have liked, and it did restrict visibility. And finally, it tended to get very dirty from the exhaust from the engine, the oil, the smoke, whatnot. So usually they just propped it back or took it off. Therefore, later versions like this, which is a Type 10, they would just do away with it altogether. It would be the first production fighter to go into service with retractable landing gear, at least the main gear. But these were crank retractable. They had to be done by hand. In the beginning, it was considered more than fast enough. It could get up to about 270 miles per hour. But quickly they decided they wanted to get up to about 290. So, new version with a new engine was tested and would go into production. Test pilots in 1934 and 1935. By the way, the original, say, 30 or so pre-production Type 1s, they were never put into squadron service, but they were used for test, evaluation, training. The pilots weren't that keen on it early on. The early engines were underpowered. Visibility was poor. It had a pretty high takeoff and landing speed. It had some interesting handling characteristics and was a little bit tough to control at times. It was also not a great gun platform. It was hard to aim the two two machine guns, I should say. And even early on, they had trouble with the machine guns jamming. They would fix this later, of course, but on the other hand, it was maneuverable. The controls were sensitive. And although early on they had concerns that it would get into an irrecoverable spin and stall out and dive to the ground, this was quickly proven by test flights to be false, that it was actually quite easy to recover. And it also proved to be very durable, as far as that goes, and very inexpensive and easy to mass produce. And again, it was one of the fastest, if not the fastest for a brief time, fighters in service. And the Type 5's baptism of fire would soon come in 1936. Now, the communists, the Republicans in Spain, begged Stalin for any fighters he could spare. They really wanted, and originally he promised to send 400, 500 fighters after they agreed to send him gold. Very communist of their comrade. Yeah, we'll give you something as long as you give us gold. Anyway, so they paid him in gold, and the first I-16s, as they were known at the time, arrived in Spain in November, and they had their first aerial victory on November 13th when they shot down a dozen or so older German, I think they were Hinkel, they might have been Henstrich, biplane bombers. And so they enjoyed a brief period where they were doing very well against older aircraft, but it would not last long at all. By 1937, Germany sent their own newfangled fighter to Spain, the Bf-109, the Messerschmitt. And in most ways, even the early versions of the Messerschmitt, which had their own issues, but the Messerschmitt was faster and nominally better armed. And that was an early complaint that the Spanish had. Just not enough firepower. Therefore, the T6 was introduced, which had 3 7.62 caliber machine guns. They also discovered that the I-16, designed for Russia's climate, did not like the heat and the dust in Spain. So they had to kind of work on filters and cooling systems to keep that running. They also would add extra armor, as they found even the armor around the pilot and the fuel tanks was not always enough to stop machine gun bullets. They would continue to send these over till 1938. And the Type 10 would be introduced with an additional machine gun for a total of 4 7.62. Any of you that own a Mosin Nagant, yes, they fired the same ammunition as that. And newer versions were capable, when armed up, of achieving about 285 miles per hour, although some later versions, either light-loaded or specialized, could go over 300 miles per hour. Also, they had a max altitude of just shy of 32,000 feet, which I'm sure was just super comfortable in the open cockpit. By the Type 10 here, they had pretty much gone away from the cockpit idea and just left it open. By the way, the cockpit pilots always complained it was hard to get in and out of. Again, it just, typical Soviet, you know how it goes. For a time, Polikarpov was in favor with Stalin again. In fact, he was awarded the Lenin Prize, I think it was 1935 or 1936, as this was going into main service. However, by 1937, 1938, as the deficiencies of the I-16 were becoming known, and as more and more were lost to Bf-109s in Spain, again, Stalin's affections cooled. When the war ended in Spain in April of 1939, Russia had sent around 273, and of those, fewer than 100 were left. About 112 had been shot down, 62 had been lost in accidents, and the remainder were just so badly damaged they had to be written off. So after the showing in Spain, which by the way the Republicans called this the Moscow Fly because of its stubby fuselage, it was intentionally short to try to help with speed and whatnot. If you look at the pea shooter, it's kind of a similar thing. In fact, this, although it really has nothing to do with the pea shooter, the P-26, some foreign observers from America thought it was a copy of the Boeing design because, you know, those Russians, I mean, they couldn't actually make their own plane, right? Well, next, Stalin would send 250 over to China to help out the communists there, and they would go up against Japanese planes like the A-5M and the Ki-27. And they did okay, pretty decent against those two, but then once the A-6M0 appeared, it obviously dominated this aircraft. In 1939, they did try increasing the firepower yet again. Remember, the Type 10 has 4 machine guns. They tried installing 2 20mm cannon. Other versions, they even tried installing a couple of 50 caliber machine guns. Pilots did like this heavy firepower, and for a time the I-16 was the most heavily armed standard production fighter in the world. But Russia did not have enough cannon, and this extra hardware, along with new radios and larger engines, just kept adding weight upon weight to the plane. And Air Force officials declared in 1939 that, look, we've advanced this design as much as we can. We cannot really improve it any more than has been done. So by 1939, the design was pretty much frozen for this, the I-16, but of course that was not the same for the Bf-109. It had many more versions to go, meaning that by the 40s, it was just outright trouncing this plane. And of course, yet again, Stalin was pissed at Polikarpov, but this time he basically forced his retirement and resignation. At least he didn't threaten to get him shot. The I-16 was used by Russia in the Winter War in Finland and was still in frontline service in 1940. And when Operation Barbarossa began in June of 1941, Russia had over 1,600 in service, and of these, fewer than 1,000 survived the opening day or two. Many destroyed on the ground as their bases were attacked by the Germans. And then by the end of June, just over 800 were still left. And of those, about 100 were needing repair. So only about 700 in flyable conditions going into July of 1941. Now, Russia had new aircraft on the drawing board, but for a time, the I-16, even the older I-15, would have to hold the line. These were produced primarily at 4 different Russian factories, and production would continue until 1942, and then it was ordered to be wrapped up. They would continue building airframes and whatnot with the remaining parts, and the last one seemed to have rolled off the production line in 1943, although some sources say a few trickled out in 1944. But by that time, we have newer planes like the Lavochkin, the Yak, and the MiG. And where the Bf-109 was pretty much superior to the I-16 in every way, except maybe maneuverability on the horizontal, the newer Russian fighters would give it a run for its money. They would produce around 10,200 of these. And actually, after the initial wave of destruction, one thing that became clear about the I-16, it was a durable design. The engine in particular proved to be relatively light on maintenance. But of course, this is very much a pre-war design. One thing that's interesting, when they were trying to arm this up, it was one of the first fighters to be equipped with aerial unguided rockets. And it actually made a rocket kill for the first time in 1939 when being operated in China. It could also carry 500 kilograms in bombs. Not a large load, but, something. So by 1944, this was very much in second-line service. They would also build a 2-seat trainer version. And then when the war ended in 1945, the VVS officially declared this obsolete and retired it. Many were given to China and other Soviet allies, but by that time they were experimenting with jets, and they had plenty of MiG-3s, Yak-3s, and LA-7s, so they did not need it anymore. Things were so desperate in 1941 that some I-16 pilots would even do kamikaze missions. Obviously, they didn't call them that, but they would ram German aircraft, especially larger ones, with their planes. So they were definitely not lacking for bravery and determination and guts. And to be fair, it had a lot of firsts under its belt, and this lasted a lot longer than the pea shooter or the Bristol Bulldog. But, yeah. I will cover some other Russian planes. It's kind of hard to find diecast models of these, but I've scavenged what I could over the years. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.